Well, good afternoon or good morning to everyone, depending on, or even good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Geoff Perlman. I'm the founder and CEO of Xojo, and I'm here with William Yu, who's a senior engineer at Xojo. He's been here for quite some time. And today we're going to be talking about the nuts and bolts of preemptive threads, which is a relatively new feature and one that William is primarily responsible for. So let's jump into it. Now, if you have questions, you'll notice that there's a Q&A panel in Zoom. You can type your questions in there. And just as we go along, feel free to fill them in whenever you want. We will get to the questions at the end of the session. So what are we going to be covering? First, we're going to talk about what threads are. You probably know if you're in this webinar, but I just want to make sure. And we'll be talking about what's special about preemptive threads, what they can do, what they cannot do, avoiding conflicts when updating data, debugging preemptive threads, managing large data processing jobs, which classes are safe and not safe to use in a preemptive thread, and things to look out for when you're using them. And then last but not least, we'll have some time for questions. Okay. So what are threads? Well, again, if you're here, you probably already know what threads are. They contain code that can run independently of the rest of your app. They run in the background, keeping your UI responsive. And now we have two types. For a long time, we had one type, and that was cooperative threads. Now we have cooperative and preemptive threads. Cooperative threads run independently of the rest of the code in your app. They and your app all run together on the same CPU core, and this is probably the thing that really separates them from preemptive threads. That means they share execution time. Now, what's special about preemptive threads? Well, they can run on a separate CPU core from your app. Now, I put the word can there in italics because they don't necessarily run on a separate CPU core. They certainly can, and whether they do or not is not within your control, and we'll get to that in a little bit. That means they can avoid sharing execution time with your app, but they won't always necessarily. And you create one by setting the thread.type property to preemptive. It's an enumeration. It defaults to cooperative, but you set it to preemptive in order to create a preemptive thread. Preemptive threads are not currently supported on Android. They will eventually be supported on Android. They're just not supported at the moment. Okay, so what can preemptive threads do? Well, they can process data faster than cooperative threads because they can run on multiple CPU cores. And the more cores your CPU has, the more they can process in parallel. That's kind of obvious. And as new computers are coming out, they're coming out with more and more cores. That's definitely what's been happening. We've kind of reached or are reaching the theoretical limits of what we can do with CPU speed. So CPUs have been adding more and more cores so we can at least do more processing in parallel. Now, here's where you run out of control over this. Each operating system has a thread scheduler, and that decides which core a thread will be assigned to. So obviously, they don't necessarily all use exactly the same logic, but you can imagine if you were in charge of the thread schedule, how you'd write it. You'd look to see when a new thread pops up, a preemptive thread. Is there a core that's not in use? Can I assign it to that? If not, which cores are busy and which cores are not so busy? So you try to spread the load to the degree that you can. But the point being is you don't have control over that. Xojo doesn't have control over that. So it's basically up to the operating system to decide. And that means that in theory, your preemptive thread, depending on how busy your computer is, could end up on the same core as your app and end up sharing time. But again, the more cores you have, the less likely that is to happen. And of course, the less busy your computer is doing other things, the less likely that is to happen. Now, what can preemptive threads not do? Well, just like cooperative threads, they cannot access the user interface classes, such as desktop window, desktop button, etc., in the run event. So if you need to access that kind of stuff, then use the thread.addUserInterfaceUpdate method along with the thread.userInterfaceUpdate event. In that event, you can access that stuff. That's where you should be doing it. You can, if you've never used these before, you can send data and cause the event, the user interface update event to fire by calling the add user interface update method. It's pretty easy to use, and it makes all the access to the UI possible. The reason, if you're not aware of this, the reason that you cannot access things like desktop window and button, etc., is that on pretty much every operating system, all the UI type stuff, windows, menus, buttons, none of the code in the operating systems is thread safe for that. So it just doesn't work to call it. And a preemptive thread cannot sleep other threads. It can sleep itself, but it can't sleep other threads. So those are the three things that preemptive threads cannot do. Oh, and there's a fourth thing. They cannot, it's not, this is properly worded. It's not that they cannot modify the same data at the same time. It's that doing so is bad. And we'll talk about that more in a second. So avoiding conflicts when updating data. So when you have multiple threads modifying data, if they're modifying at the same time, that can cause problems, as you can imagine. This is called a race condition. Believe it or not, I've been a programmer for a really long time, and I've heard this term thrown around, and I guess I just hadn't done enough work with threads because I didn't realize that a race condition is two threads trying to modify this, or really two things trying to modify the same data at the same time. But that's what it's called. It's a race condition. And Xojo has something to solve this problem. It's called critical section. It's a class that can be used basically to give any particular thread the exclusivity to execute code for a moment. And I'm going to show you an example of that. So once a thread enters a critical section, all the other threads that if they have critical sections they're trying to or they want to execute will pause. And again, we'll take a look at that in the example. So what critical section helps you do is avoid having multiple threads modifying the same data at the same time. So here's a really simple example of a method that's using a critical section. So this method's called add goals, and the idea is that maybe you have a sports team, like a hockey team, and you call this and pass a player's name, and you pass in how many goals you want to add to their total, and it's going to go find the player in an array of players, and then it's going to add the number of goals you've passed. And of course, this is modifying the contents of an object that's part of an array, and so you want to make sure that if you have multiple threads that they're not doing that at the same time. So the way we use a critical section is you create one as an object. You can see that at the top. Then you call the enter method. That causes the critical section to start, the protection that it provides rather to start. And then in this case, it's simply finding the player by name and then updating their score. And then at the end, you can see that we call the critical section leave method. So when enter is fired, it's going to look to see whether or not there's any other critical sections running in any other threads. And if there are, it will wait at that point for those others to clear before it enters. So only one thread can be in a critical section at a time. So that's how you protect yourself from having multiple threads modifying the same data. You'll notice, by the way, that in this example, I've got the portion of the code that's just looking through the array inside the critical section. Now, that doesn't modify the array, so you might think, well, why bother having that in there? Well, it's because if another thread was, say, adding players, then obviously that could cause problems for my loop that's looping through the players. So that needs to be inside the critical section as well. Okay, debugging. Now, when you break in one thread, the other threads can still be running, of course. Breaking's on a thread-by-thread basis. However, at some point, the other threads may break. That's just something to know about when you're debugging. William and I talked about trying to explain why this is, and it's due to some of the complexity inside the frameworks and how they work. It would probably not be worth going into all that, but just know that if you break in one thread and you're stepping through code and all of a sudden another thread, breaks into the debugger, that's not unexpected. That can happen. Now, if you run into a race condition, as we've been talking about, that will cause your app to crash. Um, we're not used to that happening in Xojo. We're not used to things causing the app to actually crash. We're used to things dropping the app into the debugger and things like that, or an exception. But in this case, at least at the moment, a race condition will actually crash the app. Now, the good news is that in the next release, in 2024 R4, a race condition crash will actually drop you into the debugger, assuming you're running from the IDE, obviously. And that's one other thing I want to mention is that when you're running preemptive threads from the IDE, and William, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that they run as cooperative threads in the IDE. So if you're really trying to fully test your code with preemptive threads, you really need to build and test the built version.
No, Geoff. When you run your app in the IDE, preemptive
Yeah.
threads will run preemptively too.
Oh, okay. That's good to know. I for some reason I thought that they ran cooperatively. Was that the case early on?
No, I think you might be thinking of workers.
Oh, you're right. You're right. Sorry. That's correct. Yeah. Workers run that way, but yeah, sorry. That's correct. Okay. That's good. Good thing you're here, William. All right. Managing large data processing jobs. So we have an example and a class. We have an example project that has a class in it called Threadpool. You can find it in the examples by searching for Threadpool. Threadpool was written by Xojo MVP Kem Tekene. And basically, it makes it easier to slice up a task into multiple preemptive threads. It manages all those threads for you. It basically saves you from writing a whole bunch of complicated code that you would otherwise have to write. So if you have a job and you're trying to make that job, utilize as many threads or many threads to just get it done as efficiently as possible, processing a lot of text files, that sort of thing. That's where Threadpool is really, really handy. It also is a great way to show the difference between cooperative and preemptive threads because it's got some examples in there and you can really see the performance difference between the two. So definitely, if you're starting to want to experiment with preemptive threads, I highly recommend looking at Threadpool. Especially if you're going to have a project where you need to break up a job into multiple parts and have lots of preemptive threads running to get it done as quickly as possible. Okay, so let's talk about which framework classes are safe to use. Nearly all the framework classes that are not UI related are safe to use. There are a few exceptions, but we'll get to those. Picture class, that is safe to use. We've made sure that's thread safe. And by extension, that means graphics. RGB surface is safe to use. All the database classes are safe to use. Now, what about those that are not so safe? Again, all of the UI related classes are not safe unless you use them with the user interface update event. So you do have a workaround for that. Just use them through that event. Xojo script is not currently safe to use. It may eventually be, but it's not at the moment. Runtime.iterate objects. I don't know how many of you have used that. It's pretty low level, but that is not safe to use in the preemptive thread. And iterators in general, if you're modifying data, as long as you're not modifying data, they're safe to use. But as an example, if you're using an iterator to iterate through, say, a folder of files, and let's say one is iterating through the files, and you've got another preemptive thread that is modifying the contents of that folder, maybe adding files, changing file names, deleting files. Well, that would make it unsafe to use. So in that case, you'd have to make sure that you're using, critical sections so that they aren't. This is an external object, right? It's not one of your objects. It's something in the file system. But again, because it can be, if you're modifying it in two different places inside two different preemptive threads, that you can see how that could cause a problem. One preemptive thread is adding files, the other is trying to read how many files there are or iterate through them. That's not going to work unless you use critical section. So just be aware with iterators that there's that potential. Okay, some things to watch out for. Preemptive threads can't protect you the way Xojo typically does with things like exceptions. There's no Stack Overflow checking, for example, in a preemptive thread. And that means if your stack overflows, your app will crash. Now, your stack shouldn't be overflowing anyway, but if it does, the app's going to crash rather than give you an exception. So bear that in mind. And of course, as I said, be careful when iterating. Iterators are great. They're one of my favorite features that we've added to Xojo. But when it comes to preemptive threads, you just have to be a little more careful when you're using iterators. And when you're modifying things, especially arrays and dictionaries, make sure to use critical section. As you saw in the example, it's really super easy to use. I mean, you create one, you call the enter method, and then you do your code and you call leave when you're done. There is another method for critical section. It's called try enter, and the difference is that try enter is a function which will return true if it's executing the code. If it returns false, in other words, if it enters the critical section. If it returns false, that means some other critical section was running elsewhere. So if you need to know that, then that's where, rather than having to pause, that's where try enter can be really, really useful. Oh, and one important point, when you use a critical section with a preemptive thread, critical section has a type property, and that needs to be set to preemptive as well for it to work properly in a preemptive thread. There's also semaphores, which are a lower level. I think of them as a lower level component, similar to critical section. They also have a type property that needs to be set to preemptive if you want to use them with preemptive threads. Just be aware of that. I find the critical section, handles things really, really well. So I tend to prefer to use that. But if you find you want to use semaphore, just be aware that it too has a type property, again, that has to match. It has to be set to preemptive. And why now? Why are we adding preemptive threads now? Well, we added them in R3. It was R3, William? Is that correct?
Yes, that's
Yeah,
what
okay.
we
I
just
thought it
said.
was. Yeah. Anyway, why are we adding them now? Well, we've been talking about preemptive threads what seems like forever. I can remember it about 20 years ago when we first started talking about them. And adding preemptive threads was a very big job. It took William quite a long time. And it's a very advanced feature. It's not a feature that most users will use, but it is a feature that if you need it, it's great that it's there. The reason that we finally got around to adding them is a simple one. We put everything we do into sort of a priority order. And we've had a lot of fairly big projects. If you've been in the Xojo community for a while, you've seen that. And we just finally got to the point where we had the time available to do it, and we're really glad we did. They're a terrific feature. Again, there's just some things you can't do without them, or at least not do efficiently. So it's terrific that we finally have them now. I'm very, very happy. William did just a terrific job on them. So that's why they're finally here now. All right, let's get some questions. Let me get the Q&A panel up here. Uh, where is the Q&A panel? Hang on a second. There it is. Okay. Edwin's asking, how are preemptive threads different from workers? William, you want to answer that?
Sure. I can say they're similar to workers in that they run on separate cores. Workers are just um, external apps that get executed, and those can run on separate cores. And preemptive threads are the same way. You create one, and when you start it, it gets launched in a separate core. So those are the similarities between preemptive threads and workers. Now, the difference is how you communicate with workers is different, right? Uh, when you send data back, that has to go through some kind of socket. And so the difference there is with preemptive threads, they all run on the same process. And so you can share memory, you can access the same, classes, etc. So the big difference there is that you have access to pretty much what's ever in your app without having to like transfer data back and forth through sockets, for example.
And workers are much more heavy-handed than preemptive threads are. Preemptive threads are pretty lightweight compared
Yep.
to workers, but the downside is that with workers, you can kind of do anything you want and not think about it. Whereas with preemptive threads, you have to be careful, essentially, with what you do, like we've been talking about earlier. So they each have their use. There's another question from Edwin. So if I enter a critical section where I update dataset A and another thread wants to alter dataset B, that would not cause a conflict. That's correct. Um, it's really it's really only when critical section you use a critical section when two threads are going to be potentially modifying the same data. If it's different data, it's not an issue. It's just when it's going to be modifying the same data. If you have an array, for example, like in the example I showed, you've got an array of objects, and two different preemptive threads might be modifying that array at the same time. That would be an issue. So that's where you'd want to use a critical section. But if it's two different arrays, hey, have at it. You can have, all the preemptive threads you want, as long as they're all altering different data, then there would be no need for a critical section. But again, think about the fact that, like, let's say it was an array of folder items from a folder. If if you have a preemptive thread that happens to be going to the same folder and modifying the contents of that folder, that's this external thing, right? External to your data, then that can cause problems. So you don't want two preemptive threads trying to modify the same data, same content at the same time. There's another question. Oh, there's several more questions. Great. Okay. Someone who came on anonymously um, says, how could the IDE itself honor preemptive threads? What sections could compile and project? Oh, I think what he's asking is, he or she is asking, is could the IDE use preemptive threads for things like compiling and such? William?
Oh, absolutely. We've actually had some success with autocomplete, which we'd love to preemptive thread that part of it. There are certain parts like loading plugins, we'd love to be able to preemptive thread those. So there's definitely parts of our IDE that we can, and we'll definitely uh, probably look into that. But at the moment, we haven't done any of that work just yet. So, but definitely we want to do that.
And that same user is asking, well, actually, it just says anonymous, so this could be multiple people for all I know. Could the project search and analyzer and things use preemptive, be sped up by preemptive threads? In other words, is there more to the IDE that we could use preemptive threads to make it more speedy and efficient?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes, we definitely can.
Yeah. And it's just a matter of time. That's just one of those things where it's another thing on our list
Yep.
uh, to do. Um, so another user is asking, what has been the most annoying area in Xojo when it came to implementing preemptive threads?
Yeah, I mean, there's many annoying areas, of course. I think one of the biggest one where we had a question mark on is can we support exceptions? And we did have to um do a few things to get that to work. And one part was updating a compiler to admit certain things that makes it work. So we're glad that it's working now, but that was a bit of a annoying topic for sure.
Okay, so Jared's asking, do critical sections need to be created as properties so that there can be a critical section for protecting object A and a separate critical section for protecting object B? You want to answer that one, William?
I'm trying to understand that one.
Well, I guess he's saying, do they need to be properties? I don't. I think the answer is no. I mean, you can like in my example, I created just a local variable, and all that matters is that a critical section object exists and is in the enter state,
Right.
essentially.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, you don't necessarily need to use properties there. Um, Michael's asking, any plans for an auto reset event? I'm not sure exactly what you're asking there. William, does that ring a bell with you? Do you know what he means?
Unfortunately, no.
Okay. Michael, if you could just update your question and just ask it again and maybe give us a little more info, we'll try to answer that one. Um, Steve is asking, oh, we got a lot of questions. This is great. Um, we got through the content of the webinar pretty fast, and so it's great to have a bunch of questions at the end here. Steve is asking, can we start and run workers calling dot start and all the job request events run in a preemptive thread from a preemptive thread? The admin of workers can have a toll on the main thread when also attempting animation. Oh, so I think it sounds like he's asking, would it be beneficial to run a worker from a preemptive thread?
That is an interesting question. I mean, obviously you could run shell jobs from a preemptive thread, so uh, these are essentially like shell jobs. So if that makes sense in your app, then I guess that works. Um,
Okay.
yeah.
Here's another question. Um, Am I right in thinking that the way to read write into a SQL database that is being accessed via active record with preemptive threads would be to use a critical section? Any specifics or tips in regarding to SQLite data reading, writing with preemptive threads? Well, I will say this. If you have multiple preemptive threads writing to the same SQLite database, you're going to need to use, what's it called, William? In SQLite, the sort of multi-user feature. I'm just drawing a blank on
Do you have a multi-threaded property? Is that what you're?
well, there's a feature in SQLite for this purpose, and people use it to allow multiple users to access a SQLite database at the same time.
Right.
I'm just drawing a
So,
blank. Well, what that's called.
so just to make everyone aware that SQLite does have a multi-thread property, and we enabled it. So SQLite is safe to be used in a
Yeah,
multi-thread environment.
but there is I just can't remember what it's called, but there's a feature that you can turn on, and we have access to it. I think in the API, the SQLite, the database API.
Someone's
I'm
mentioning
just
the write ahead logging. Is that right?
yes, that's it. Right ahead logging. Yeah, yeah. So um, I would think that you would have to be using that to for if you have multiple preemptive threads all accessing a SQLite database at the same time. If you don't have write-ahead logging on, it just seems like that would not be a good thing. Or am I wrong about that?
I might not be as familiar with that one, but
Well, without that, would you expect it to work properly from preemptive threads if more than one thread is writing to the database at the same time, or would you treat that as data just like any other kind of data? And so they would need to use critical section to make sure that two preemptive threads don't write to the database simultaneously.
right. It should work because we've enabled the multi-thread support. So yeah,
Okay.
it
All
should
right. I
work.
haven't tried that. So yeah, you may want to try that just to be sure.
Yep.
Edwin's asking, so critical sections live globally in the app? That sounds like that's correct. Is that right, William?
That question is confusing to me, but you can create multiple critical sections, right?
Yes.
So
But any one critical section, I guess what he's asking is if you've got two preemptive threads and they each create a critical section, only one of those is going to be able to execute at a time, right?
depends what you mean by that. I mean, you can lock multiple critical sections. You can enter, I mean, multiple critical sections. So
So
There's
in other
not,
words, yeah, it has to be the same critical
it's
section.
not like a mutex. Let's say it's not like a
Right.
mutex. Yeah,
It would have to be the
mutexes are
same.
global.
Right. It would have to be the same critical section. So
Yeah.
it's smart enough to know that, basically. I hope that answers the question. But yeah, it's actually smarter than you think. It's not simply that they're global. All right, Michael's asking. Oh, yeah, he was giving us better, more info on what he was asking about. He says an auto reset event is used with producer slash consumer pattern, usually with a queue. The consumer thread waits on an auto reset event. Producer puts items in the queue and sets event to set. Threads wake up and take over from the queue. Now look at .NET auto reset event documentation. I kind of wonder if this is what Ken was trying to do with thread pool, kind of handling all that complexity for you.
Yeah, sounds like it.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm not familiar with .NET, Michael, but take a look at the thread pool class and the example because that might be the answer to your question. Oh yes, and several people were reminding me that it's writing and logging. Just haven't thought about that in a really long time. Yeah, the acronym is WAL. Okay. Um, let's see. Now, Michael's asking, he's not asking, he's making a statement. He's saying critical sections need to be properties since they have to be shared between threads. Is that accurate? Or can they just be a like a local variable?
No, they need to be properties. You don't want to create just the critical section for um, one part of the code, for example.
Okay, so they do need to be properties. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I should have made that more clear in my example. Um, okay. Oh, someone's asking, will it be another webinar, a pre-Christmas webinar? I'm not 100% sure if we'll have one next month or not. We try to have a webinar every month. I don't know if we'll have one next month or not. All right, Steve's asking, are there any concerns switching threads back and forth between preemptive and cooperative modes?
So we didn't touch on this, but you can actually switch the types at any point in time. Although with preemptive threads, you can switch the type only when in your run event, for example. So another way of synchronizing your code may be to switch from preemptive to cooperative, do your whatever you need to do, and then switch it back to preemptive. The problem with that is the cost of the transition. And so I would not recommend doing that. It takes a bit of time to switch um, thread types. So your best bet is just to add a critical section or add a user interface update, for example, to do that.
Okay. Um, Another question is, I think the question on critical sections is the lock slash enter for one an atomic action. That is, the Xojo framework manages the critical section, and there's no risk of race condition on the critical section instance.
That is correct. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's basically what they're there for. Okay, and let's see. Got a couple more questions here. Actually, let me clean this up a bit because I haven't been um, closing these. Okay, so Jared's asking to clarify about the critical sections as properties. Do they just automatically know what resources they're protecting? That the answer to that's no, right? Well, I mean, basically, you're just you have this object and it knows it's in a certain state. The critical section's in the active or enter state, and it's up to you to then do whatever you're going to do. And when you leave the state, it's like a flag, basically, right?
Right. And we should probably point people to Gabriel's blog post about critical
Oh
section.
yeah, I did mean to put that into the webinar. One of the slides. Yeah, Gabriel wrote a great blog post about preemptive threads. So go to the blog and just if you just search for preemptive, you'll find it. That's definitely worth reading. All right, Dirk, excuse me, is asking how does the type switching work internally? So how did you manage to build the thread class to be able to switch from cooperative to preemptive?
Well, that's more of an internal detail sort of question, but I mean, if you think about it, um, basically with a preemptive thread, when we tell it to switch back to cooperative, we have to get it back into our cooperative thread schedule. And so there's certain things that we need to do to stop that preemptive thread and hook it back up. But that's all internal implementation details.
Yeah. Okay, and it seems like we have one question left. If a thread's creating new files in a folder, would it be a problem to try to open these files from the main thread before/during the time they are created, other than the main thread will not be able to open them since they don't exist yet? So yeah, so if you're creating files in a folder from a preemptive thread, um, the main thread's going to see those. It's not like a database transaction. The moment they're created from the preemptive thread, the main thread would have access to them. Right, William? I mean, I don't see the conflict there.
Yeah, there should not be any conflict there.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, that was the last question. And I really appreciate they're all great questions. Really appreciate you guys asking them. We really appreciate you attending this webinar. We, again, try to do them about once a month. We'll see if we're going to have a December webinar or not. We usually do. We'll see. But anyway, we really appreciate you coming, and we appreciate you being Xojo users. You make all of this possible for us. And on behalf of everybody at Xojo, again, thank you for being a customer. Thank you for being a user. And until next time, happy coding. Bye for now.
Bye.